Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and friends. Welcome to the Eye on Africa. Today, we have the honor and privilege of hosting Professor Robert Montgomery, who will be speaking to us today about building conservation capacities in Uganda. Before he speaks, I want to let you know that next week we have Sharif Keita. He's the William H. Laird Professor of French and the Liberal Arts from Carleton College. He will be speaking on a topic from Northfield, Minnesota to the land of the Zulus, the Odyssey of a Rebel Missionary. That is next Thursday, November 7th, 2019, here in the African Studies Center in room 201 of the International Center. I also want to let you know about this great event that's coming up December the 3rd. This is our Year of Global Africa Grand Finale. It's a great event. Please mark it on your calendars. It is going to be in the Michigan State University Ballroom at the Union, at the Student Union. It will start from 5 p.m. to 8 p.m. Great, great event. Please attend, and we would be honored to see you there. Our guest today is a friend and a recognized colleague who has done great and wonderful work at the Michigan State University campus as well as on the African continent. And we are proud to introduce Dr. Robert Montgomery. He is the director of the research on the ecology of carnivores and their prey, otherwise known as the RECAP laboratory. He's also professor of wildlife ecology and conservation at Michigan State University. He is with the research. He's a research associate in wildlife conservation and research unit that is with University of Oxford. He's also a member of the International Union for Conservation of Nature, Giraffe and Okapi Special Group. Dr. Montgomery maintains a richly diverse laboratory which conducts research-informed conservation work around the globe. The objective of his laboratory is to develop sustainable solutions around the globe, promoting wildlife conservation while building local capacities in an effort to improve human livelihood and well-being. To do so, Dr. Montgomery recruits students from his host countries, which diversifies expertise in his laboratory and develops the next generation of wildlife conservation leaders. Dr. Montgomery has received numerous awards in recognition of his scholarship and teaching, including the Outstanding Faculty Mentor Award from the Graduate School at Michigan State University, the MSU Teacher Scholar Award, the John K. Hudzik the John K. Hudzik Emerging International Leadership Award from the International Studies and Programs at MSU, and Excellence in Teaching Award from the College of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Montgomery.
Thank you, Isaac, for that warm introduction, and thank you all for the opportunity to come and speak with you today, particularly on a day that harkens of winter with this blustery and rainy weather. Stay safe out there while trick-or-treating tonight, everybody. We don't want to have any frostbite. It's my pleasure to come and speak with you today. Across the presentation, you're going to be hearing me speak. This is not about me in any way, shape, or form. I would like to acknowledge my co-author on this presentation, soon to be Dr. Tutilo Mudumba. Tutilo has been a graduate student here who has benefited from the mentorship that Isaac has provided across the past 5 years and the warm embrace of international studies and programs, and particularly the African Studies Center with Jamie. He's going to be finishing up his PhD in 3 weeks, and in January he'll be starting an assistant professorship at Makerere University in Uganda. So he's a testimonial of the approach that we have in the laboratory. It's also important for me to describe that my words are not my own, but they are a product of the other individuals that work in Uganda with us. And these are just a few of them. This is our team. And these are the individuals that are in Uganda year-round conducting our capacity building work. I speak on behalf of them. I also speak on behalf of our local community. So the community members that have entrusted with us to implement a conservation solution to gauge its efficacy, both on returns on wildlife conservation populations, but also returns on the quality of life of local people. And this picture is an important one because it raises an interesting word, a word that I find to be very interesting, and that is community. And the more that I hear it, the less I understand actually what a community means. And so we've initiated a research project to evaluate what is meant by community. And of course, community is variable, but oftentimes it leads us to think about the Global South. Whereas we have local communities here in East Lansing, and why would that be any different? And there's probably more connectivity and more things in common between these various communities of local people than there are differences. But the reason why this is complicated is because community is a part of a very dominant theme that exists in conservation, which is called community-based conservation. And this has become a nomenclature that is widely spoken about, and many people feel that they understand precisely what that means. And I, for one, have no idea what that means. And so what we decided to do was to initiate a research project to trace the origins of community-based conservation, because we had recognized some of the issues that could develop when implementing this framework among local communities in places like sub-Saharan Africa. So I just started asking the question, where does this phrase come from? We did a literature review in collaboration with MSU libraries here, and we actually traced the origins of it. And I can share with you these data. This has just been submitted as part of a publication that we've developed in the lab. But this is a very simple plot which identifies year from 1993 to the present and number of papers. So the first time that community-based conservation was used as a phrase was in 1993. It was by two authors, Wells and Brandon, that demonstrated rhetoric that had been a part of development-based literature and had been borrowed and applied to conservation. And that phrase existed among peer-reviewed literature at very low levels for the better part of a decade. These are the trends in number of papers per year that began citing community-based conservation somewhere within their manuscript. And then we see a completely different pattern when we look at 2003 to the present. And we see a virtual explosion of papers that begin citing this design. And this is exponential growth in this philosophy in the peer-reviewed literature. And that's not to suggest that this isn't going on in the gray literature too. It absolutely is. In fact, the levels are even higher there, but I was interested specifically in the peer-reviewed literature. So this demonstrated a pattern which was divergent based on a time period, which got me wondering what happened in 2003. And in 2003, in Durban, South Africa, there was a conference which was part of the World Parks Congress, IUCN, the global organization responsible for conducting conservation work. They had a conference in Durban, South Africa, which was called Benefits Beyond Boundaries, which is actually a very interesting turn of phrase. Now, we need to look into the reports of this conference. And fortunately, one of our co-authors, an individual who's been greatly involved, Dr. Mordecai Ogata from Kenya, was actually at that conference. And so that presented some very interesting opportunity to evaluate what was going on. So what I can tell you about this conference is that it was 10 years in the making. This was a big deal. 10 years in the making. We had 3,000 experts invited from some 160 countries to attend this meeting. And the idea was to foster interdisciplinary research teams with the approach of pulling together a bunch of people to essentially reinvent the way in which conservation practice was conducted in the Global South. So the ceremonies were opened by then President Mbeki. Queen Noor of Jordan was there, and Mr. Nelson Mandela. This was an extremely big event. In their opening ceremonies, this is what they said. These individuals emphasized the extraordinary success story of creating protected areas as perhaps the greatest single collective land use decision ever taken. Speakers also focused upon the essential need for protected areas to become mainstreamed into broader human concerns, culturally and economically, to capitalize on the benefits they can contribute to sustainable development and poverty reduction. Indeed, the very survival of these areas depend upon it. This was where we first started seeing these philosophies of land must pay rent in order to garner its conservation, that wildlife must be valuable to people in order for them to be protected. We see the presentation of protected areas as the greatest single collective land use decision ever taken. I wonder how many local people pushed off of their land when these protected areas were established, were consulted as part of these procedures. They went on to say that an inclusive approach to protected areas, one which forges productive partnerships and builds trust, is necessary. If we boil it down into its central components, we can look at this time period and identify that this was 1993 and then leading up to 2003 was a time period in which there was great unrest in terms of the ways in which local people were being consulted with land use decisions and conservation practice in the global south. This was a really, really important time period, and one in which, from a donor perspective, it was becoming more difficult to get external funding and support for your conservation projects if you were excluding local people. This demonstrates the birthplace of community-based conservation, which when we look at it in its bare components, it was suggesting we are now raising money and our conservation efforts are based in local communities. The objective was sound, okay? To focus on development, economic revenue potential, partnerships, and building trust. The extent to which the subsequent research on this topic, which has been exponential, has met that mandate is an important one to ask. That is where we developed this new philosophy. So the presentation that I will be providing to you today is not one which is based on community-based approaches. I actually don't subscribe to them. I subscribe to heritage-centered conservation. And we've developed a new model with a series of mandates. I'll show you what it looks like in practice, and then I'll walk you through each of the 10 steps that we feel are fundamentally important to this conservation philosophy. With a focus in my research laboratory is really on large carnivores. And large carnivores are interesting for a number of reasons, but particularly so because of the position that they inhabit in ecosystems. They inhabit apex predator positions most often, where they exert subsequent impacts on prey populations, which have impacts on the environment and have impacts on local people. And so when we look at the complexity of these systems, we must assess every aspect of it to determine the valuable connections that are within. Now, we're always looking for laws that govern the natural world, like physics. You know, we love these laws that physics have, and we look for those in the natural world, and they're very hard to come by. In fact, the only one I've really been able to come by is that there can never be more predators than there are prey populations necessary to support them. So what that tells us is that predators, or carnivores, are always rare comparative to the prey populations. They've always been rare over time. That's actually not a particularly interesting question. The question is, why are they so rare? So with this next part of my presentation, I'm going to show you the population trends from 1900 to the present of 3 carnivores that globally in society we tend to care quite a lot about. So the first are cheetahs. And if we look at 1900, we can see that there are about 100,000 in Africa. All the way to the present, we see that there's been a 13-fold population reduction, and there's about 8,000 cheetahs that are left in the world. Let's look at tigers. Maybe that's a better example. Well, with tigers, we see a 26-fold population reduction with time and 3,800 tigers. In fact, there are more tigers in captivity than there are in the wild. If we look at lions, maybe I have a more optimistic scenario with lions. Unfortunately, lions at the turn of the 20th century were an order of magnitude higher in population than either of these 2 species. And so their population levels are much worse. We see a 43-fold population reduction in lions, with about 25,000 lions that are left in the world today. The question really is, why is this the case? Why can we no longer sustain large carnivores in the world? What are the issues that we confront? So it isn't just these 3 species. It's almost all large carnivores. There are 31 species of large carnivores left on the planet. Over 3/4 of them have populations that are declining. So carnivores globally are doing very, very poorly. So we investigate why this is the case. Now, we know the tried and true things. A colleague from University of Oxford, David MacDonald, published this paper a couple years ago, which retranslated Hieronymus Bosch's 7 deadly sins into the 7 deadly threats to conservation. And they're all the standard ones: habitat loss and climate change and disease and speciation, and all of these types of things that we know to really be problematic. These all affect carnivores. But there's another one that's really influential. And that 7th one involves hunting. In hunting, we can talk about both the sanctioned variety, right, the one that we hear quite a lot about in the news, such as trophy hunting, but we can also think about the unsanctioned variety, where we've had this turn of phrase called poaching, which has been applied to different people that decide to illegally take wildlife. So that is a particularly important issue, which will be the subject of my presentation today. Now, I like to trace words and figure out where they come from and why they're influential and things like this, and you'd be hard-pressed to find a word that is more literally translated into the face of an idea than poaching. In fact, if I were to talk to a student walking across campus and say, "What can you tell me about poaching?" it probably wouldn't be too long before they're telling me about somebody living a very rough existence in Africa and the crimes upon elephants and rhino, and all of those things are problematic, right? These global things that we see with illegal trade of wildlife, it's very problematic. But it doesn't actually connect well with the term poaching. So I think what is important is for me to actually show you the truest image that I have ever found of a poacher, so that we can kick off this presentation and entertain a dialogue about exactly what we're talking about. So I found this picture a couple years ago, and for me, it is the most literal depiction of a poacher that I have ever encountered. I'll show it to you now. For us, this image might be slightly different to the one that we have in our mind, because society has told us exactly what a poacher is. A poacher tends to be a black person living in Africa, trying to sell illegal products on the black market, and that actually couldn't be further from the truth. In fact, the original application of the term poaching was applied to English citizens in the middle of the 19th century. This is a very fundamentally important point. Poaching, as a terminology, comes from the French word to poach, which is to put in a bag or to cook in a bag. You know, when you talk about poaching eggs, that's a specific style of cooking. That came over in the 17th century. And then it wasn't very long before this idea of put in a bag was applied to the illegal take of wildlife. And why was that? Well, the reason why that was because at that time, England was chopped up into lordly estates. So wealthy landowners owned the land, and the wildlife that existed on that property was their own private possession and could be managed by their independent gamekeepers. We have a very different model here in the United States. But that English model is a very important one, because local people, acting as serfs on the lord of the manor, if they were to dare come on that land and take a rabbit or take a pheasant, or you could easily conceal that animal once killed in a bag, they were deemed to be a poacher. So I was at Lady Lever Gallery in Liverpool, England, 2 years ago, as my brother-in-law was getting married, and I was trying to keep my children away from priceless piece of artwork, thinking that they were going to totter over and knock over a sculpture that was going to smash, and I was going to have a massive bill to pay. And I came around the corner and I saw this painting on the wall, and I knew precisely what it was. This is a painting by Breton Rivière, which is called Fidelity, painted in 1869. And what it depicts is a local person who grew up next to Lord of the Manor's estate and dared go on that property with his dog and chase down a rabbit so that he could have a meal at the end of the day, subject to criminal prosecution. There's 2 important points from interpretation of this image. One, the first application of the term poaching was applied to English people, and the only reason why it was applied was because there were not administrative systems in place that allowed those local people to sustainably harvest wildlife. Those, I think, are really 2 important points where we can look at what's going on in modern society and understand that reflection. So with that, I can take you to our study system. So we work in Uganda in a place called Murchison Falls National Park. It's the largest national park in Uganda. It exists in the northwest corner along the border of Congo and not too far from South Sudan. This is where the Nile River begins. It starts as rainfall in the mountains and trickles into Lake Albert. You have a 200-foot waterfall that splits Murchison Falls in two, and that river flows all the way to Egypt. The waterway of this national park is really important for the primary pathology that exists in this region. On the surface, this is your sort of wonderful savanna landscape, just like Disney has taught us about. We've got lions chasing down beautiful species in this particular national park, such as the Ugandan kob. Ugandan kob exist in this national park at higher levels than anywhere else. Our studies have shown that there are more than 200 kob per square kilometer inside of Murchison Falls National Park. The prey biomass is unbelievable for the wildlife. So on the surface, this looks beautiful and wonderful and great, and unfortunately, this is a spot in the world where you have the highest levels of subsistence poaching anywhere on Earth. And the subsistence poaching here is done by wire snare. Wire snares are an interesting item. They begin their life in radial vehicle tires. Inside of one tire, if you burn it down, you can have hundreds of wire snares that come out of that raw material. We see these here. We're driving down I-96, you see a blown out vehicle tire and it's got shards sticking up all over the place, right? That's the internal skeleton of that tire. We look at that as rubbish in this country. In other places, you can look at that as an opportunity. From those tires, you get these hundreds of wire snares, and if you're a person that is so inclined to participate in an insanely risky activity, you might take those wires into the national park in a dugout canoe, making landfall and working up game trails, attaching these items in very rudimentary fashion to a tree that's able to hold an animal once it's caught with a lasso. It's so simple. All you're trying to do is get an animal to walk through and pull so tightly that they can't get undone, and they're held in place, at which point you can come, kill them, and then butcher the meat in the field for return to the market. Your intended targets are things like this. So this is an African buffalo. You'd like to get cob, but unfortunately this type of technology, so basic as it is completely indiscriminate. And so while your intended target might be something like a cob, you're almost just as likely to get an animal like a giraffe. So this is a young giraffe who got caught around the lower left leg. We always see giraffes that are broken free from their constriction because they are so fiercely strong, but in the process of pulling themselves free, they can dislocate a hip, they can break bones, they have mutilated injuries as a result of these interactions with wire snares. This is an elephant. The elephant looks healthy, but if you look closer, you'll see that it has half of a trunk. Elephants will actually get the prehensile component of their trunk caught in a wire snare. It just snaps it right off. An elephant with half of a trunk is a dead elephant walking. It's only a matter of time. The first thing that they do is try to go to the river because they're dehydrated. They try to feed upon the aquatic vegetation, but that doesn't work very well. Oftentimes in this national park, we can see elephants that are down on all fours feeding like a cow, trying to get grass. It doesn't work, and over the course of several months, they waste away. The species for which we see tremendous problems are lions. We don't really understand why it affects lions more than other species, but it probably has something to do with the canopy structure that's necessary for the trees that are sturdy enough to hold an animal in its place, just the same types of trees that lions retreat to in the heat of the midday sun. It might just be that they get tangled up in them. So a reasonable question at this point is, why are the subsistence poaching levels so high in Murchison Falls National Park? And it's important to explore the context that has afflicted this particular region. So you'll recognize this individual as Joseph Kony. Joseph Kony spent the middle 1990s up to the middle 2000s camped out in Murchison Falls National Park. It was his base of operations, where he was warring with President Museveni of Uganda. And in the mid-1990s, splashed on international news as a point of demonstration of power, burning down an extremely large and the only Ugandan-owned safari lodge in Murchison Falls National Park. Because of the civil instability, tens of thousands of people that lived in the communities directly around the park were moved by the government to what are called internally displaced peoples camps. These essentially are refugee camps in your own country. And they were made to stay there for several years while the government battled with Joseph Kony. The government was eventually successful. They pushed Joseph Kony out of Uganda. He's taken up residence in Central African Republic and continues to commit these atrocities in that country. And finally, all these local people were able to come back to their villages which were war-torn, their villages which lacked resources, which lacked occupation, businesses. You walk back to a village that hardly looks like the one that you left, and you're supposed to just make do. Now, what lots of people growing up in places like Uganda would like is they would like to have these beautiful longhorn cattle. But this is incredibly expensive technology, one that requires a lot of resources and knowledge to understand how to raise these animals sustainably. And if you can't have that and you're frustrated by your circumstances and you look into a huge national park where there are 200 cob per square kilometer, no fence, and nobody can really tell you where the administrative boundary is, and yet if you go into that particular place and you take one of those animals, you're subject to criminal prosecution. This seems unjust to me. And so in my laboratory, we really focus on the social justice dimensions of conservation, because we take for granted certain things that are common practice in places like Uganda that are immensely troubling when we break them down and understand the context that is within. This is an individual caught inside of Murchison Falls National Park poaching. He is a poacher, as they say. He is illegally taking wildlife. 2 months ago, the government of Uganda revised their legal procedures. And they implemented a policy that if you are caught inside of a national park poaching, you are subject to life imprisonment. Now, in society, we think about poaching, and again, we think about elephants, and that's vile and heinous, killing animals for trinkets that end up in different markets around the world. But the vast majority of poaching involves local people. And that is what we're talking about in this case. We're talking about subsistence poaching done by local people. The face of poaching in places like Uganda is the face of 12-year-old boys. Those boys that aren't capable of graduating from primary to secondary school because of resources in the home, poor grades, lack of opportunity, lack of access. And at 12 years old, the system can forget about you. And what do? You try to bring some food home, you try to bring some money home. So these kids are immensely vulnerable because they're hanging around markets looking for things to do. And poachers in the community recognize that they can't get caught with illegal product. And so one of the things that they'll do is they'll recruit 12-year-old boys to take a bag into a market and give it to the meat seller. A little bit of money, the kid doesn't ask questions, this seems too good to be true, takes the money back home, mama. This is a very good situation, come back tomorrow and we'll repeat the exercise. The kid comes back tomorrow. Well, it's a week later, and this unsuspecting child is in the middle of a national park field butchering an antelope because he's gotten inadvertently sucked into the poaching trade, where if he's caught inside of a national park, he might do life in prison. So this is precisely where we have targeted our intervention. This is our community. These are the individuals that we're focusing on. And I'm happy because Tutilo has just arrived. Tutilo, who's the co-presenter here. So introduce Tutilo Mudumba. I already said a lot of good things about you. You can trust me. Yeah. Tutilo's in this picture. Animal biographies are really important, actually being willing to tell the stories of individual animals. In wildlife conservation, we don't do a good job of that because we manage animals at the level of their population or at the species level. And what we focus on is that the species and the populations are comprised of individuals, and those individuals matter. This is a very important individual. His name is Butcherman. He was a young alpha male that challenged a little bit too early, but gained the alpha male position in the Delta Pride. He only ruled for about a year when he was caught in a wire snare around his rear left leg and underwent a field amputation, thanks to Tutilo's efforts in Uganda Wildlife Authority, to sever the limb. It was so challenging and so difficult that nobody on the spot thought that there was any chance that Butcherman would survive that surgery. Incredibly, he did survive. And you can see him here lying in the dust. It's a little bit hard to tell, but this is directly before he had to undergo a second surgery because the femur bone popped through the scar. They had to dart him again, actually cut off a portion of the bone so that they could suture the skin properly. Once again, no one thought that there was any potential that he would survive. Not only did he survive, but he thrived. And he ruled the Delta Pride for a further 3 years on 3 legs. This is where Butcherman became better described by mythology than ecology. Now that wasn't Butcherman's only brush with wire snares, because unfortunately, just a year after that picture was taken, he was caught around the neck yet again, and almost died if it wasn't for Tutilo and Uganda Wildlife Authority coming in to provide an intervention. I show this image because all of us, we can't help but make eye contact with the animal. And from an anthropomorphic perspective, again, I'm breaking conventions in conservation science. We can't be anthropomorphic. I think we can. I gaze into that animal's eyes and I see an individual who's suffering, living in an extremely unpredictable environment, where at any moment you can get caught in a wire snare which changes your life. Now, we oftentimes conceptualize poaching as a wildlife problem. It's not a wildlife problem. It's a wildlife consequence. The problem exists in the local human communities. That's where the problem starts. And we need to reorient ourselves so that we're actually focusing on the things that really matter so we can evidentially make a difference. The snaring damage is awful. And again, I told you that it really affects lions. We see lions that are captured around the wrists, which require amputation. We see lions that are captured around the head or around the waist that might look like that lion is wearing a belt, but that's a scar from a former snaring injury. And unfortunately, we find that alpha males are particularly likely to be captured in wire snares. We don't understand it, we're looking into it. But once an alpha male is killed, it triggers the nastiest part of animal behavior, which is called infanticide, where a new male will challenge for that pride, and the first thing he'll do is kill all of the existing cubs so that he can actually bring the female back to sexual receptivity and pass along his genes to the population. It's an aspect of animal ecology which is particularly difficult to understand. However, it happens, and when it happens, and if the alpha male is removed from that pride with such regularity, the population actually can't recover. And so this is exactly what we've seen in Murchison Falls. For the last 6 years, the population has plateaued at right about 146 animals. It cannot recover because of the rate at which alpha males in particular are being pulled out of the population. So this has dramatic consequences on the cubs. And our estimates show that there's about 40% snaring damage among the lion population. Almost half of all lions in this national park have a snaring injury. That tells us something about the problem. So this was the issue that we were trying to address. This is how we were organizing our activities. And of course, this brings up into our minds, what can we do? How can we fix this? How can we solve this problem? And so Tutilo worked with Uganda Wildlife Authority to implement these incredibly clever wire snare sweeps. And we fit statistical models that were quite sophisticated, and they were able to predict with reliable predictive ability the spatial distribution of snares in the landscape. These optimized our removal efforts. And to be honest with you, we're pretty good at it. This is a picture of some of the wire snares that we removed, and we've got a hut there which provides us with a sense of scale. And you might look at that image and say, wow, that must have taken a really long time to get that amount of wire snares. That was a week. A week of effort inside of this national park to remove these wire snares led to that accumulation. That's a human problem, because every single one of those wire snares speaks to important issues that are afflicting the human community. Subsistence poaching is an act of desperation. You don't have young boys and girls that are growing up aspiring to be a subsistence poacher when they grow up. It's circumstances that dictate that, okay? It's important that we understand that. So we actually, and this is a classic part of science, you come up with a great idea and it actually makes your problem worse. And this is a particularly illustrative example of that. What we actually did by removing all those wire snares is we created a problem of where to keep them. And we decided that we would lock them up into this building, which were formerly offices. and we just put a master lock on them. What we actually did was we concentrated the supply of wire snares into an identifiable location where they were much easier to come by. You no longer had to burn down tires. You could just break into the storeroom and take the wire snares. So we actually made the problem worse. Well, then we had this idea of, well, what about if we, you have to have 6, 8, 10-foot lengths of wire to attach it to a tree and then make a lasso. What about if we just cut them up and break them down into smaller parts? We were focusing on destroying the wire snares. And every time we give this presentation, Tutilo and I, when we give it to an audience in the States, for instance, we'll have somebody raise their hand and say, why don't you just smelt them down? And of course we would do that. There are no resources in the local communities to possibly do that, right? So we were focusing on destroying these things. And that was exactly where we had a moment of inspiration, which created a new model, okay? As opposed to destroying them, what we did when living on the edge of Poaching, Uganda, this small community directly adjacent to Murchison Falls National Park, we began observing the ways in which the local people were using upcycled products of all different types. And what we noticed was that this particular craft existed in the local communities of making things from wire. The item on your left is a rudimentary lampshade. The item on your right is a small hand truck that the kids have in the villages. Oftentimes they come with a long stick on them so the kids can push them around. These are incredibly cool pieces with a lot of ingenuity. You have disused pencils or wood for the axles of the wheels. The wheels are made out of flip-flop material. There's a lot of cool stuff there. The only contribution that we have had is by suggesting that the local people might make a slightly different product from the wire snares. These are great and they're marvelous, but it's not long before every kid in the local community has one of these and the market is completely saturated, and you'd be hard pressed to find a tourist willing to go into this village so that they could purchase a hand truck, right? All we said was, what about if we make something that might be sellable to tourists, or indeed might even be sellable in the West? What about if instead of making these trucks, we made sculptures of some of the wildlife that are particularly vulnerable to wire snaring? So where we were focusing on destruction, we decided instead to focus on construction. This is Murchison Falls. He was one of our first artisans. He came and found Tutilo and presented him with an example of his art. It's difficult to see in this picture, but that's a female lioness head at full scale. You kind of make out the ears and the nose. It's an incredibly cool folk art piece. This is the community in which we began to develop. You can see predominantly young males, the same demographic that's particularly vulnerable to being sucked into the poaching trade. We have engaged to become artisans as part of what we call the Snares to Wares initiative. We began in 2015 with 5 artisans. We were very patient in the way in which we built this initiative so as to always focus on the local community members first. Our slow and steady approach has begun to bear fruit because now we have over 500 people whose primary livelihood is dependent upon the Snares to Wares initiative. These are the types of pieces that we develop. These are our traditional standard pieces. The one on the right is one of the first vintages that we had for the wire snares. You can see it's a giraffe with proportions that are slightly off. Why are those proportions slightly off? Because Tutilo's research has demonstrated that 92% of the people living directly on the border of Murchison Falls National Park have never been into the national park. So if you engaged a young child and asked them, gave them a crayon and a piece of paper and asked them to draw you a picture of a giraffe, they would be hard pressed to do so. They live directly on the border of this national park. Imagine that in our Western framework. Let's take Rocky Mountain National Park, for instance, or Yellowstone National Park. 92% of the local people living on the border of that national park had never been in. It's absurd. But of course, we have implemented payment structures that are prohibitive for most local people. A tourist permit in Murchison Falls will cost you $14 a day. Tutilo's research has demonstrated that most local people make about $150 in a year. So you're telling me that I'm going to take 10% of my annual take-home for one day inside of a national park? Oh, and by the way, you need a vehicle. Where am I going to get that? The reason why the Snares to Wares initiative works is because our objective is simple. The only reason why wires are used to participate in subsistence poaching is because the items necessary to participate are freely available. That's the only reason why wires are used. Another question that Tutilo and I often get is, why aren't they using guns? Guns? They couldn't even afford bullets, much less guns, right? So our objective is really, really straightforward. If we can change the value of wire from something to nothing, then we can make a difference in this local community. That's why we need to pursue alternative revenue generating approaches that use raw materials in the landscape. That's the approach. We also make elephants, 2 different types, sculptures and heads on the wall, with beadwork done by local women. And we also make images of lions. These products are available on the surplus store via e-commerce, drop down, add to cart, ship anywhere in the United States. We also take orders through our own devices here for shipment across the world. And the interesting thing has been different types of commissions that we've had. A couple years ago, the Institute for Quantitative Health Science and Engineering, which is a new medical center, medical research center at Michigan State University, which is run by Director Chris Contag, invited us over. He had a brand new building, 4 stories, just on the south part of campus near Baker Woodlot. And he had heard about the Snares to Wares initiative, and like a traveling salesman, I showed up with a few examples of our product, thinking that he was going to purchase some of our smaller sculptures. And he said, this giraffe is great, I'll take it, but I'm interested in a slightly larger piece. And I said, well, that's interesting, how large? And they said, well, tell me, how big do giraffes get in the wild? And I said, well, bulls can get up to 18 feet. He said, great, we'll do a 19-foot giraffe. I laughed because I thought it was funny, he didn't. I said, you're serious? And he said, yeah. Eventually we talked him down to a 15-foot giraffe. And I said, but wait, we're going to have to, there's no way we'll be able to make it with actual Ugandan wire. And he said, why not? And I said, well, we'd have to ship it here. And he said, then ship it here. So we shipped 40 boxes of wire snares from Uganda to Michigan State University. We brought 2 of our artisans from Poaching, Uganda over to spend a full semester on campus building this piece. Keep in mind that these artisans had never been outside of Poaching, Uganda before in their lives. They spent an entire semester working with us, along with an MSU undergraduate, a mature student in the Department of Art, History, and Design called Richard Tanner, who helped us fabricate the internal skeleton. And I'll show you the piece here in just a second that we developed. So this is part of our integrated research program involving research, teaching, training, and engagement. Our research is multifaceted: animal response to risk, research-informed conservation activities, research implementation gap. We focus on all aspects: how the animals are actually responding to the wire snares. Can they perceive that? Do they change their behavior according to it? Research-informed conservation, we're actively removing these wire snares and providing them to the local communities. Research implementation gap, we have these major divisions between the research sphere and the implementation of on-the-ground actions and policies, so we're working hand in hand with Uganda Wildlife Authority to provide them with the information that they need to make dynamic and responsive decisions. We've also developed a course which is built completely around this and conducted just across the road in the hub in Wells Hall. And we position 20 students each spring to become business operators of the Snares to Wares initiative. This provides an opportunity for MSU undergraduates that maybe don't have the economic abilities to do study abroad while they're here on campus, but that doesn't mean that they can't make an international impact. So 20 students each year focus on building the different dimensions of this business. This is what the course looks like. They've provided attention for our Ugandan students on local media. They were instrumental in a commercial which currently runs on the Big Ten Network telling this story. This is Tutilo presenting at the National Geographic Explorers Fest, as he is a National Geographic early career explorer, all wrapped around the Snares to Wares initiative. The students have made so many of these things possible. This is the giraffe that the director of IQ received, and this is part of the venue where we unveiled this giraffe to the public in collaboration with the Broad Museum. You can see that the piece is 15 feet tall and sits on a piece of wood, which is actually MSU Shadows Collection wood. So this is wood that has come down in inclement weather like today sustainably repurposed wood. So these are actual trees from Michigan State University campus, which the piece does a very good job of acting as a metaphor, demonstrating the collaborative potential of Michigan State with places like Uganda around ideas such as these. We were also invited to do another life-size piece, and this was an invitation from the Detroit Zoological Society because they actually wanted to do a year-long run of an art exhibition on the Snares to Wares initiative, which you can currently go and see in the Wildlife Interpretive Gallery of Detroit Zoo. They said that they wanted to show the progression of our pieces from 2015 to the present. We have loaned them 32 of our pieces, which across 2 floors tell the story of the initiative, focusing on the local community and our students. And they wanted to culminate it with a life-size piece. In this case, we said to them, what about if we did a life-size piece of Butcher Man? And fortunately, they allowed us to do so. So that's precisely what we did. This is the finished piece of Butcher Man, again missing his lower left leg, which has created very interesting dialogues amongst the Detroit zoo-going public. Children are asking their parents, why is it missing a leg? And parents are having to explain that to their kids. And you would be surprised how quickly kids get completely what the piece is conveying. Another reason why the Snares to Wares initiative has been successful is because the pieces themselves can tell the story. And that's a wonderful part of it. We also prepared 3 lion cubs, which of course serve as an example of the consequences when an alpha male dies. So Butcher Man is walking in front of these cubs, protecting them from a future that they would experience without him there. The entire materials, educational materials, outreach messages associated with every part of this art exhibition were written and prepared by the students in this course. So the students got to contribute to an art exhibition which over the course of this run is able to reach 1.4 million people in Detroit Zoo. So it's incredible impact that we've had. This is a top secret project, which I probably shouldn't even be talking about right now because I know that this is videoed for posterity. But we recognize that it was a great opportunity for a small number of our artisans to come to the States. Right? That's incredible. But it isn't necessarily building huge amounts of capacity. You have particularly profound experiences for a few people, and those people can conduct training in Uganda. But what about if we took local expertise and provided it to a broader range of our artisans in country? So that's precisely what we have done this past summer. As opposed to bringing our artisans to Michigan, we brought Michigan artists to Uganda. So a collaboration with College of Arts and Letters sent 3 representatives from the Department of Art History, and Design into Murchison Falls, where we coordinated a workshop to teach welding skills to our team. Welding skills that are not only valuable for the construction of life-size pieces, but welding skills that are immensely valuable in local trade and employment opportunities. All 15 of these individuals got letters of recommendation, which were written by Tutilo and myself, so that they can go out and get sustainable long-term jobs. And on the side, they can be developing art as part of the Snares to Wares initiative. 2 of the artisans that spent 6 months or 4 months, in this case, on campus with us, went right back and used the support that they generated from their time here at Michigan State University to open companion businesses in Poaching. So they have secondary businesses that they simultaneously run, diversifying their portfolio of funding so that they can stabilize and focus on the well-being of their family. So as part of this workshop, we've entertained a project. And what you're going to see here is a life-size elephant, which the team has prepared, and the team is giving as a gift to Uganda Wildlife Authority in gratitude for the depth of collaboration that they have had with us across the time that we've been working in this particular place. This will be at the entrance to Murchison Falls National Park, where every tourist coming into the national park will have the ability to see the work that is done by local people. Local people that oftentimes are subject wrongfully to stereotypes about their standard of education or their level of occupation or their tendencies, okay? Local people that are now demonstrating that they can do more than what others suggest that they can. Members of our team have run for local office and been elected as MPs in the various districts here in Uganda. It's completely unheard of. local people that are able to take positions of political office. These are but some of the ways in which we're building capacity. But it doesn't stop there. This is a particularly important figure in the Snares to Wares initiative. His name is Emma Wokurak. And Emma, when he was 7 years old, was struck by cerebral malaria, which expanded his head, caused massive swelling. He was fortunately able to survive where most kids don't, but it knocked out his sight. So from the age of 7, he was blinded. He also grew up in a family that participated in subsistence poaching, and he was made to twist metal into wire snares as a 7-year-old blind kid, until a family member replaced that metal with an African harp. And he has become a world-class musician that, ever since we've known Emma, he plays for tourists on the edge of the Nile River, where there's a ferry that'll carry tourists across. And they're held there for about 45 minutes, and Emma plays phenomenal music, but he never dreamed that he would have opportunity for anything more than that. Tutilo and I got together when we knew that there was going to be this reveal at the Broad of this life-size giraffe. And we said, something is missing in this. Something is missing. We need music. We communicated with the students that were enrolled in this course, and they aggressively fundraised to support 2 tickets to bring Emma and his guardian to the United States. That's an incredible process, given that Emma unfortunately did not have any of the necessary paperwork to get a visa, to get a passport. All of that had to be done from scratch. And he came over on a plane and spent a week with us, where he was the individual that introduced to the entire Michigan State University community the unveiling of this piece. It was accompanied with his music. I can't tell you what type of impact that this has had on Emma. This has been an absolutely phenomenal and life-changing experience. And last year, when Tutilo and I brought a couple of prospective donors into Murchison Falls National Park to thank them for the time that they had spent with us, we brought Emma to their lodge, and Emma provided them with a private performance. Based on that experience, they decided that they wanted to set up some funds to provide Emma with income for the rest of his life. The impacts that we're having are profound, and they might be one person at a time, but we're being slow and patient with how we're doing things, because each of these individuals matter for our community and what we're trying to do. When Emma, one of our other Ugandan students, Methodius, brought Emma back to Murchison Falls National Park on the return journey from Kampala, and he describes Emma just screaming with delight the entire 4.5-hour drive all the way into Murchison Falls, and him screaming across the Nile River to his friends who are on the other side as he's coming across on the ferry. And we're so lucky that Methodius captured video of that exact moment when Emma was reunited with his bandmates and played upon joyous return. The stories he tells are absolutely incredible. And so Emma is an important part of our community. So this is what the Snares to Wares initiative looks like. We do research in the field. That research informs the teaching that we do at Michigan State University. That teaching informs our broader engagement and outreach impacts. The outreach and impacts inform our capacity building efforts in local communities. Local communities inform our research, and all of these different nodes inform one another. So what the Snares to Wares initiative represents is an integrated research-informed conservation program that's built upon a model which understands the local heritage and the importance of that heritage and culture on the sustainability of conservation projects. This is what we call our heritage-centered, heritage-based conservation models, which we feel is an important expansion upon the foundation of community-based conservation. There are 10 principles that define our efforts. The first principle is to conduct common practice in the local languages. That's not to suggest that we're always going to get it right, and the local dialects are tremendously diverse. We can't possibly know them all, but we try. And we also don't just presume that everybody must speak in English, because that can lead to a lot of lack of clarity in terms of what types of agreements people are signing off to. So understanding and communicating in the local languages and the local dialects is tremendously important. Another tenet is actually valuing and tangibly incorporating traditional ecological knowledge. We hear about this, it's become a buzzword, but we don't necessarily know what to do with it. And that's a really important component to this design, is that we don't presume that some idea that I came up with on my whiteboard in East Lansing, Michigan is absolutely going to work in a local community in Uganda. In fact, there's precious little that I can provide because I didn't grow up there and I don't fully understand the problems. But Tutilo did, and Tutilo understands the problems, and that's the value of our partnership and collaboration. The third component is to foster truly interdisciplinary research teams, which include local community members. We think about interdisciplinarity in terms of if we get an anthropologist and a historian and a scientist together, then we'll come up with some solution. That's not what we're saying. We're talking about people from all cross-sections. We also want to collaborate with management authorities in research. One of the things that we see a lot in the local wildlife and management authorities is the suggestion that they don't do research. And Tutilo and I have communicated with them that you actually can't have management that's not informed by research. But unfortunately, in today's day and age, we have an outsourcing of research to Western entities, which is one of the things that can develop in a neocolonial environment. And so we are focusing on collaborating directly with Uganda Wildlife Authority, but also developing pathways for terminal degree training for Uganda Wildlife Authority employees so that they feel empowered to do research, that they can be a part of these interdisciplinary research teams. The only solutions that we provide to local communities as ideas and topics of communication are those that are drawn from the local heritage. Snares to wares might not be scalable across Uganda, much less sub-Saharan Africa, because the heritage is highly variable. Local people in other places might not be working with wire and making things out of them. So how would it be appropriate for us to suggest that they need to do that? So the solutions that we pitch are those that we observe and in consultation with the local communities understand that there might be a conservation twist on this idea. We also present clear pathways for professional development among our employees. A good example is a young man working with our team called Peter Lohonda. Peter is a protege of Tutilo, who Tutilo found over a decade ago, who started off as a field camp manager, so to speak, helping us with various things like dishes and stuff like that. It would be another example of a social injustice for Peter to be working with us and in 20 years' time to continue to be doing that. So what Tutilo and I have done is we've sat down all of our employees and tried to understand, what are we trying to do? What is your ultimate goal? And a couple of years ago, Peter told us that his goal is to become a tourism operator. And we said, that's a fantastic goal. If that's your goal, then you're going to need to know every mammal in this national park and every bird. You're going to need to speak really good English, and you're going to need to have some off-road driving certification. You know what? 2 years on, Peter is way better at mammals and birds than I am. His English is really coming along, and we're getting him that off-road driving certificate. We're also going to help him establish partnerships with the tourism operators so that they know him and he knows them, and in a few years' time, it will not surprise me when he's running his own business. That's the type of professional development that we're talking about. We also want to provide educational and technical training to the local community members, including the youth, particularly focusing on this transition from primary to secondary school. How can we help in that particular instance to fill that void? We also want to conduct terminal degree training for host country students. The only reason why I'm participating in this project is because I recruited Tutilo Mudumba to campus. That's the only reason. Now, that tends to be quite different from ways in which common practice has been done before, and that people decide that they have an affinity for a particular place, they want to work in that system, and so they go and start a project. I would say that the first thing that you need to do is recruit a student that you can train to terminal degree level who has the capacity to take over that project in just a few years' time. Tutilo is here. He's going to be graduating in 3 weeks, and that's exactly the transition point that will take place in this project. We want to promote alternative revenue generating programs. We cannot presume that conservation practice can be conducted for the next 30 years with National Science Foundation funding. Okay, hopefully we'll be able to recruit that type of support, but it probably won't be sustained across that time period. We must have a stable and diverse set of resources that we're drawing upon to ensure that we can be working with these communities for 40 years rather than a 4-year funding cycle. And we also want to make sure that every aspect of this is written up and goes through external evaluation so that it has been vetted by a number of authorities. We need to ensure that every single one of these components has been evaluated via the peer review process and entered into the public domain so that others can read it and evaluate it. So often, valuable information gets hidden in bureaucratic reports that never see the light of day. And all of that experience is lost. So we must focus on the importance of peer-reviewed publications. This is our choir and theater group that provides performances to the local people to communicate the changes in policy at the Ugandan government level. Most local people did not even see the news that there was a revision in the policy where now if you're caught capturing bushmeat inside of a national park, you're subject to life imprisonment. One of the ways in which we can communicate that to local people is by embracing the heritage and providing those performances in song and in dance and in theater. This has been an incredibly potent conduit to connect with the broader community, to pull many, many more people into the Snares to Wares initiative. These are the types of solutions that we feel are necessary to actually have a future where species such as large carnivores continue to darken the dust of places like East Africa. This is but one example of multiple that we're piloting and testing in my laboratory, and we hope that this type of story has resonated with you, and we'd be most happy to take any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Montgomery. We're going to open up the space for questions. And while you're thinking of your questions, I will take the advantage of having the mic in front of me to ask the first question. So it looks like you have a very comprehensive approach to the work that you're doing. It's not just traditional academic work. Mm-hmm. You're not an individual doing individual research for your own career trajectory, for publication in peer-reviewed journals, and then for the growth of your name in the field, which is the traditional model. You are doing something that is further than that. An integrative research program that includes local heritage and includes local people, includes training of people. I can imagine some academics saying, wait a minute, this is not what we do. Have you come across that type of backlash or criticism for a more wide-ranging research agenda?
Yeah, what an excellent question, Isaac. And I'm fortunate that I have not received direct negative feedback from colleagues, mm-hmm. but I have received immense amounts of indirect mm-hmm. feedback mm-hmm. from colleagues saying, I was at a conference and so heard what you guys are doing and they're wondering what's wrong with you. Or, they say they just don't get it. Right. And I think that's actually a great position to be in because everything that I've talked to you about today is inherently simple. Recruiting African graduate students to campus when we seek to have a project based in those host countries, mm-hmm. that's simple, mm-hmm. right? In terms of the logic, right. That's what we should be doing. Right. So the fact that colleagues are talking about that means that we haven't been doing it, and that's a problem. Right. The fact that we can develop such a simple model like heritage-centered conservation, mm-hmm. and people to say, what is that all about? That's another example. It's very simple. None of these premises, these 10 components that I talked to you about today, are earth-shattering. Right. They're what we should be doing. Mm-hmm. And so anytime that we hear that, we take it not as an affront, but as an indication that we're probably on the right path. And I've been spending an inordinate amount of time lately thinking about the connections between sort of intent and action that verbs can connote. So, you take conservation biology, for instance. Well, to conserve is the root verb that exists in there. Mm-hmm. And I could consider myself to be a conservation biologist. And I could tell you, and I could go to the grocery store and tell the checkout person I'm a conservation biologist, and that would have some societal value. Mm-hmm. But I could consider myself to be a conservation biologist without ever making any substantial contribution to conservation across my entire career. It's the same thing that we're talking about here with community-based conservation. people think that they understand what it means, but it really is empty unless we attach these other value systems to it and show the ways in which we're prioritizing our activities. So we desire to be a little bit different than the norm because we can identify instances in which there have been fundamental problems associated with common practice. There's a lot of insider-outsider dynamics, and those can create some issues.
Other questions?
Thank you so much. This was really very informative. My question is, what has been the success rate of diverting the attention from poaching into the programs that you're trying to put up for the community?
Exactly. So we actually measure the success of the initiative in a variety of different ways. The one thing that we do is we look for returns in the wildlife community. And so we're trying to determine as to whether or not our removal and repurposing of wire snares is having positive gains on the population dynamics of the wildlife. And we only started very recently, 2015. However, what I can share with you in that respect is that last year we had a moment of celebration because one of our alpha female lions, she had 5 cubs, all females, and all of them survived to reproductive age, which is unique in our system because of these issues associated with infanticide. So we are seeing some early returns on the wildlife community. We also measure the number of snares that come out of the landscape, and right now we're in an arms race with the local poachers in that we remove them and then we go back in a few weeks later and we find new ones in that system. And so we're not yet winning in that respect. It isn't that everybody has given up their snares and no longer people are participating in wire snare poaching. No, that absolutely still occurs. That is going to take a long time to change because all those people need to have alternative livelihood options to give up wire snare poaching. So that'll be a slow and steady process. The other metric that we look at is the local community. And so we do regular surveys of community perspectives, attitudes toward the initiative, toward their livelihood associated with the initiative and associated with other things that are going on in the system and indeed other things that are going on in Uganda. So we do look at those things as well. The growth in our artisans has been a very positive sign of success in that from 2015 to the present we've grown from 15 to 500. The number of companion businesses that have been developed, we take that as a positive sign. The other important point is that the sale of this art in the West, we create local markets, but the international market sale, the revenue that's generated from that funds employment for local people, continues to build capacity in local communities, and also provides these educational fellowships associated with our heritage-centered model. And so that's sustaining these impacts over time. All of those we take as positive indications, but we're constantly assessing because we don't take anything for granted.
Tutilo is here. Would you like to say?
Yeah. Get the microphone to Tutilo.
We have Tutilo here, so we're going to ask him to say a few words. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the great presentation, co-director. The Snares is a fairly young body organization with big dreams. The dream being increasing participation of local people through the heritage-based approach, so increasing their participation in determining what happens to the places where they occur in terms of how they relate to wildlife. At the moment, or for a very long time, they thought the best way they would interact is by reducing the number of wildlife, by utilizing it, so that there are fewer issues to do with the human-wildlife conflict in the areas, so that they don't have to die of starvation, even so that they can afford the medicines. That is what was there. That's what they had their hands on. At the moment, we think the Snares can change, or at least contribute to the shift in the attitude towards wildlife, as we are demonstrating with the use of sculptures, with the use of local folklore through songs and music, through opportunities, through business development, through inclusive debates. So one of the other things we do in the area is town halls. So not only the Snares to Wares people, but everybody is asked to come in. And then we bring in the Uganda Wildlife Authority, which is the body in charge of wildlife management, and people engage and debate, and that has also changed the attitude towards wildlife. And so we see the future as being more diverse in terms of wildlife management locally. Through the development of African students, we also see the future of wildlife management as being more diverse in terms of management. So conservation solutions will in the future maybe be more made by people who look more like us. Even local people may be involved at management level. So we are very appreciative of the opportunity to be part of the Eye on Africa talk today, and we are very happy for this opportunity. Thanks.
Thank you, Tutilo. We really appreciate both of you sharing this important research. And earlier on, Dr. Montgomery, you mentioned that, you were being humble about your work and said that you didn't necessarily see the kind of work you're doing as automatically scalable elsewhere. But there are aspects of it that are really clearly scalable,
right,
such as the few pointers that Tutilo just mentioned right now. I really like the idea that the community gets together in town halls. That means that the person that's just put some snares out there is in the town hall,
right,
and is hearing different perspectives about what they've just done, and what it does to the environment, and how alternative ways of working out a living might help everyone in the long run. The idea that the community is involved, that there is a clear demonstration by the protagonists of conservation to give local people a better life, so that it's not just about the law. You're not just coming again. It's not. We're not fighting against each other. You're not just policing. You don't have a policing attitude, but you're saying we need to conserve, and here are alternative ways of giving you a livelihood. Whereas to Snares is one of them.
Yeah.
Snares to Wares is one of them. And then other initiatives that are job generating, are some of them. Yeah, that way it becomes a community issue where everybody gets involved and everybody contributes ideas about how to solve the problem.
Yep.
The people who are concerned about wildlife and its conservation are not coming to the community with an attitude of accusation,
right,
and with the threat of jail and imprisonment and that type of thing. So that's a model that can be replicated in many different social problems in many different areas across the continent.
And the other aspect that we've focused on is how to reach a broader cross-section of the community. So right now our team of artisans is primarily comprised of men, and that's because poaching is almost an exclusively all-male activity. We have about 15% of our employees that are female, but with an expanding jewelry business that we now have, we're reaching many more female community members. We also are focusing on other sustainable products, reed baskets, for instance, with handles that are actually made from wire snare. Again, having that type of message. And we're also focusing on agricultural innovations as well, identifying what are the types of livelihood options that are currently being pursued, and how can we create a suite of sustainability-based products that, again, adhere to these heritage-centered models. So you're absolutely right. The model of the heritage-centered design is scalable. However, we don't presume that it is. Right. So we all
remember context.
Exactly. Exactly.
That's really great. To the extent that communities can create nodes of employment, whether it is in basketry, in bead making, jewelry, or agriculture, or snares to wares, various forms of employment. That will help immensely with the problem of poaching. And so, well, this has been a wonderful discussion. Thank you again, Dr. Montgomery. Thank you, Dr. Tubi. We appreciate this very much, and we wish you all the very best in your work in Uganda when you return. I think you're going to be a leading individual in this movement, and please know that we are in support of you, and whatever we can do from Michigan State University to allow your work to get better, we will do.
And that's been greatly expanded by the leadership training that you provided to Tutilo when he first started here as a student.
We were so pleased that he was participating in the leadership training. He was very unique in that regard. We tried to reach out to more people, but Tutilo was very, very consistent in his attendance, and we appreciate that, and it demonstrated the value of the program.
Absolutely.
So that was very useful to us. So thank you for doing that.
Yeah.
I'd like to just, since we have time, once again remind everyone that next Thursday, November 7th, we have Sheriff Cater, who's from the William H. Laird he is the William H. Laird Professor of French and the Liberal Arts at Carleton College. He'll be here talking on a topic from Northfield, Minnesota, to the land of the Zulus, the Odyssey of a rebel missionary. That is next Thursday, November 7th, here for the Eye on Africa. We have a major signature program coming up, and this is going to be our Year of Global Africa Grand Finale. That's going to be on Tuesday evening, December 3rd, 2019, from 5 p.m. to 8 p.m. At Michigan State University Ballroom in the Students' Union. That's a wonderful, wonderful event. We're working hard to create a great program. So please make sure that you are at the Students' Union on December 3rd, 2019. You will enjoy this grand finale as we celebrate almost 2 years of focus on Africa with programming and events. So this is the big event. This is the big one. And we look forward to seeing you there. Well, thank you very much. And once again, our presenters, thank you. See you next week.
you.